Hey guys, Corey, Faymus Media, and today I finally have it, the Sony A7R Mark II. So, the A7R Mark II is great. It's out of this world great, but I'm gonna mention 3 things I don't like about it first. Number 1, it doesn't come with a free lens. Number 2, it doesn't have a bunch of money in the package. And number 3, it doesn't shoot and edit the photos or video for you. Now you can see where I'm going with this. This camera is absolutely mind-blowing. This is the best camera I've ever used, especially for the price. This camera shoots internal 4K video, which by the way, we'll get to a little bit later on. The internal 4K, people have had overheating issues. Well, I haven't. Last night I left it on for almost an hour. The battery died. It was exhausted, but it did not overheat or shut off. And I had that in a room that was 74 degrees. So I don't know, maybe it's because this is a newer production model. I don't know. It just came from Sony literally 2-3 days ago. So we're gonna get to the good stuff. Internal 4K at 100 megabit and 50 megabit. Half-an-inch OLED viewfinders, the biggest viewfinder of any camera I've ever used. You've got 2.36 million dot viewfinder. The viewfinder is amazing. It's a T asterisk coating from Zeiss, so it is fantastic. I got the 24-70 on here from Zeiss. It's an f4, but don't worry, even though this is a mirrorless lens, we're gonna use it, and we're gonna shoot a little bit, but we're gonna put on some Canon lenses because I wanna point out something very, very important. I stress the word very. This camera is light years ahead of the A7S in autofocusing. Typically the Tokina 11-16, if you've used it, the autofocusing sucks. It's really slow. But on this camera with the Metabones Mark IV adapter, it is phenomenal. On the A7S, it is so slow, aliens will land and take us over before you'll get a shot in focus. This camera's got 399 autofocus points, Bion's X processor, backlit sensor, the first of its kind. This camera's light, but it's definitely thicker than the A7S. It feels better in the hands. It is a great camera to hold and use, but I'm gonna point out one more thing different than the A7S. On the side here, I just wanna point out that there's a flap that you have to fold down. I really honestly don't like that. I just don't. The A7S had 2 individual doors that open and close. They're much better. Does it matter? Not really. I just don't like it, and a lot of people probably won't either. But the camera's great in every other way. You just kind of look past it. Another thing is it only has 1 SD card slot. Is that a buzzkill? No, not really. I just wish it had 2. But now that we got that out of the way, I also want to point out that the hot shoe on this camera is much better than the A7S. It just is more reliable when firing Canon or Nikon flashes. So we're gonna get to shooting now. We're gonna do some great stills first with different lenses. We're gonna get to the video. We're gonna be in Times Square, which is that way. We're gonna be having a bunch of fun with this camera. This is not gonna be a short review. It's gonna be closer to 45 minutes probably, hopefully. This is gonna have everything packed into one. We're gonna compare it to the A7S and the D800E and show you why this is the evolution of cameras. Forget mirrorless, forget DSLR, cameras. Video and photo all in one. This is the camera. So let's get going. So the screen on the A7R Mark II is a little thinner than the A7S, not as bulky around the edging. It's a very, very nice screen. Although the same size, I think it's a overall better screen. It's just thinner and easier to maneuver. It's not as bulky, so that's a really big plus right there. And the camera feels much more comfortable to hold than the A7S. Let's start taking some photos. I'm gonna start at 3200 ISO because this is an f4 lens. Then we'll switch to a different lens and we'll get down to 400 to 800 ISO. And the further we get away from here and closer to Times Square, the brighter it'll be. But show you how well this camera does perform in low light. Although it's not as good as the A7S, so you're only gonna get the 25,600 in S-Log2, but you'll get full 100, 2,400 when you're shooting photos. Let's take a walk, take some shots, and let's start putting the A7R Mark II to the test. We're shooting on red right now in 5K, so by the time I bring this down to 4K and put these photos in there, you're gonna see them pretty true at about 1/3 of their size, and they're gonna look great. The autofocusing on this camera is insane. It's absolutely stunning. It's still very light, but very comfortable. And like I said, the viewfinder, fantastic viewfinder.
It's not a game, it's a rich thing.
Out the lens at f/22, we hit a brick wall. So let's go ahead and turn it up, 25,600, and here we go. On this screen, it looks okay. When I get it in post, I will really know how things are at 25,600. Just a great camera considering what it does, and the low light capabilities are really good. Such a great sight to look at, right? Enjoy it. The traffic makes it not worth it. And as you can see, there's ambulances everywhere, fire trucks, sirens. Truly is the city that never sleeps. Well, almost never.
So let's take a look at the S-Log2 ungraded and then graded in full frame mode. Looks fantastic. How does it look in Super 35 crop mode? Well, here we go. Same thing. Looks great in S-Log2, and then once it's graded, it looks even better. And let's go ahead and try internal 4K 100 megabit, and I did slightly overexpose it, but the dynamic range is about the same. There's really no difference if you're recording externally or internally. Let's go ahead and check out all three side by side, and you can see they all look fantastic with the exception that I overexposed the internal 4K slightly. And as we crop in 300%, Super 35 crop mode is definitely sharper than full frame, although the Shogun and internal 4K both perform exactly the same. A7R2 versus A7S in S-Log2, both look very similar. The white balance is going to be different because they're not exact. I couldn't quite get them 100%. Once we grade them, they both look fantastic. So let's go ahead and crop in 300%. And side by side, you can see that the A7R Mark II is ever so slightly sharper. It's almost unnoticeable, though both cameras perform fantastically. So let's move on to the chart sharpness test. Here we go, full frame mode versus Super 35 mode. and you can't really tell at 100%. So let's crop in 300%, and you can see plain as day the Super 35 crop mode is so much sharper than the full frame mode. But let's compare them both side by side with the A7S. It's really hard to tell which one is the sharpest at 100% crop. So we're going to go ahead and crop in 300% and see which one's the sharpest. And as you can see, Super 35 crop mode and the A7S are about neck and neck, and they're much, much sharper than the full frame mode on the A7R Mark II. How does photo mode compare? Here's 100% crop of the 42.3 megapixel camera. Once we crop in 300%, you can see it is so sharp, it's making my eyes hurt. So let's kick things off with a low light test first. Full frame mode, starting it off at ISO 800. Anything below ISO 3200 is going to be very clean on the full frame mode, but after that it starts to get noisy. I believe it has something to do with pixel binning and how Sony has set the camera up for the sensor readout, because Super 35 mode is definitely cleaner and the pixel density is much smaller than the A7S, so the noise seems a lot cleaner. By the time we get to 6400 ISO, you can see the noise is starting to creep around the midtones and the shadows, but it's not too bad. By the time we get to 12,800, things start to get a little hectic and the noise starts to dance. Although in comparison to most DSLRs on the market right now, it's still fairly clean. By the time we get to 25,600, it's starting to fall apart miserably. So let's go ahead and see how it compares to Super 35 crop mode. And while you're in Super 35 crop mode, anything below 6400 is going to have practically zero noise, especially if your lighting is even halfway decent. And as you can see, at 1600 ISO, it is just beautifully clean. You can't get much better than that. So we're going to go ahead and move along to ISO 3200, and it's the same thing. It is spotless. Because of the pixel density being so small, the noise is finer and more of a film grain, so it's not as blocky as the A7S is when you get really high into the ISO, or most DSLRs are. And here we are at 12,800, and you can see the noise is starting to dance a little bit on the chair and, of course, in the shadows, and it gets a little worse at 25,600, but it's so fine, it actually is pleasing even at this high of an ISO. So let's put them head-to-head, full frame mode versus Super 35 crop mode, ISO 800. Not going to be much of a difference until about 6400 ISO. They're about comparable until you get to 6400. Once you hit that mark, that's where things start to go south for full frame mode. Super 35 crop mode holds on well. It's due to the finer pixel density of the sensor. The noise is just much finer and more film grain and not as blocky. And as you can see, by 6400 ISO, full frame mode is starting to show some noise, where Super 35 crop mode is not. At 12,800, it becomes apparent which is a better setup. Full frame mode is starting to get even noisier. Super 35 crop mode looks great. Even at 25,600, the Super 35 crop mode looks epic. Full frame mode is tapping out. It has quit. It has left the building. Time to put Super 35 crop mode on the A7R Mark II against the A7S, the king of low light. How's it going to fare? Well, let's find out. 800 ISO, very little difference. And pay no attention to the white balance. I couldn't quite get it 100%, but it has nothing to do with low light performance. At 1600 ISO, they're both pretty much neck and neck. By the time we get to 3200 ISO, you can see, believe it or not, the A7S is showing a little bit of grain, and the Super 35 crop mode on the A7R Mark II is not. At 6400 ISO, the A7R Mark II is slightly ahead. The A7S is showing more visible noise. At 12,800, that trend continues, but it's due to the pixel density. There's more megapixels, means the noise is going to be smaller and finer. By the time we get to 25,600, it's clear that the A7R Mark II is a cleaner image. This was mind-boggling to me. It's fantastic, though. Let's go ahead and check out the full-frame rolling shutter on the A7R Mark II, and you can see that it's pretty bad. In fact, it's about the same as the A7S. No real improvement, but Super 35 crop mode has definitely improved, as you can see here. By the time we compare them side by side and you really take a look at them, you can see that the Super 35 crop mode definitely has very little rolling shutter. It's definitely noticeable at times, but it's much, much better than full frame mode. Let's go and compare A7R full frame mode versus the A7S full frame mode, and you can see that they're about neck and neck, although the A7S seems to be slightly better. Let's compare APS-C on A7S to A7R Mark II at Super 35, and you'll see they're very similar, although the A7R Mark II is slightly better. If you compare them all side by side, the Mark II at full frame is the worst. So here we go, low light photo test. Starting things out at ISO 400, which is retarded because it's not going to have any noise below 1600 or 3200 ISO anyway. This room wasn't lit very well at all, and as you can see, there's no noise at 1600 ISO because of the high megapixel count. The pixel density, like I said many times, is so small the noise will feel more like grain. So it's not going to look that bad even when it does start to peak its head. As you can see at 6400 ISO, the colors start to slightly degrade and noise is starting to appear in the shadows and midtones. At 12,800, it starts to get a little worse. Color degrades a little further, but still a very usable image. 25,600 is the brink of usability in my opinion, but in a desperate situation, you got to accept the cards that you're dealt and deal with it. But it doesn't do too bad. At 51,200, it's kind of fallen apart. By 102,400, the image is tapping out. But what do you expect? It's a 42.3 megapixel camera. So let's go ahead and compare the A7R Mark II to the Nikon D800E in a low-light photo test, and this will show you where technology has gone in the last few years. Anything below 3200 ISO is going to be about neck and neck. After that, you're going to see a true difference between the performance of these cameras. More megapixels and better low light in the A7R Mark II. That's how much better technology is getting. Pay no attention to the white balance though. I didn't have enough time to correct them. To be close enough, I apologize, but it has nothing to do with low light really. So here we go, 6400 ISO, and you can see the D800E is starting to have more noise, and by 12,800, the usability on the D800E has gone out the window. It's fallen to its death at a 100-story building. 25,600 is even worse. It is done. It's tapped out. A7R Mark II is much better, and the D800E can't even go to 51,200 or 102,400. It's just gone. It's out of here. The A7R Mark II is the evolution of cameras and technology. It's great. It's epic. The Sony A7R Mark II is truly a game changer. Sony keep delivering the goods year after year. And now you're in medium format territory with 42.3 megapixels, but you have much better low light than any medium format camera on the planet. They're also giving us internal 4K at 100 megabits a second and 60 megabits a second, and you're getting 1080p and 720p all in S-Log2. And the native ISO for S-Log2 is now 800, which has no noise at all. And because of the way Sony has set this up in Super 35 crop mode due to the high megapixel count, it actually has finer details and finer noise patterns, so this camera actually performs better in most circumstances than the A7S does. Just remember to shoot in Super 35 crop mode in 4K. Do not shoot in 1080p. This camera is absolutely stunning. Sony has given us everything we've wanted and everything the A7S should have been. But now, this camera is here and it delivers on everything we expected. The A7R Mark II is not just an evolution of Sony's cameras, but a revolution of how cameras in the future ought to be.
So guys, the Sony A7R Mark II is a dream come true. You need to go buy one. The only downfall of this camera really is it doesn't work well with the Canon 50mm 1.4. That's it. The 16-35, 24-70, 24-105, the Sigma lenses, Tokina lenses, Canon mount or Nikon mount all work with the Metabones adapters. Then you have all the Sony Zeiss glass for mirrorless, the FE mount glass that works flawlessly. So your limitations, not really any. The camera is flawless with the exception of those few things. And of course, I don't like the record button being where my thumb is, but that's fine. I'll get over it. So will mostly anybody. The camera's thicker and more balanced than the A7S. The A7S is fantastic, but this camera is perfect. The sensor is flawless. It's 43 megapixel. It's great in low light. Dynamic range is fantastic. Much better than the Canon 5DSR. Much better. The low light on that camera is good, but the dynamic range is not that great. At least nowhere near as good as this camera. So this is the all-around camera. Sony has slapped everybody in the face. So the Sony A7R Mark II's got the T-asterisk coating from Zeiss. The viewfinder is the biggest in the business, period. It's bigger than the D800, D810, the D4S, the 1DX, the 5D Mark III, the 5DSR, all of them. We could sit here and name them all, but this is the biggest viewfinder and the best. It is just great. The viewfinder is stunning, perfect, marvelous. I love this camera. It's so comfortable to hold in the hands. This is everything that the A7S should have been. But as we progress into the future, things keep getting better, naturally. You wouldn't want to have an A7R Mark II and then 6 months to a year later, you're releasing a 5D. It's backwards. So of course things are going to get better. So as time goes on, sporadically as I find really marvelous gear, I'm going to say things like that. But all kidding aside, this camera has a few things that aren't so good, but they're very few. Like the record button being here, one SD card slot, and I like the door better on the A7S. But other than that, fantastic. What else could you want? So if you're looking for a great camera, that shoots video or photo, especially the internal 4K. I've had no problems with it overheating or shutting off up to 45 minutes of shooting. No problem. And nobody's had problems with the 60 megabit codec in 4K. So in reality, it may just be because it was the first batch that had problems. I don't know. I just haven't had any issues. So the camera's great. It does everything. Doesn't matter if you're a videographer or photographer, this is the all-around camera to get. So since there's nothing really left to say, we can just sit around and jaw jack about Times Square, because I've already said everything there is to say about this beauty. It doesn't come with gold or money, and it doesn't do the work for you. That's about the only downfall. Joanne, is there anything really left to say? I've said everything about this camera. So guys, hopefully you found this review helpful. As always, to purchase any of the gear I've reviewed today, please support the channel and use the links in the information box below to keep the reviews coming. And I do my best to keep more stuff coming for you, like the Canon C300 Mark II. That's coming real soon, hopefully. I'm also working with Kessler directly, so I got some Kessler crane reviews coming in the next few weeks. All kinds of goodies, guys. Stay tuned. I'm gonna have some more news and reviews updates coming as well. Just remember to support the channel, purchase any of the gear you plan on buying from the links I provide below. Subscribe if you haven't already. And if you have already subscribed, keep watching. Got more good stuff coming. I'm Corey with Faymus Media, and happy shooting.